My son was airlifted off a hiking trail. While he fought for his life, my mother-in-law texted, "Missed the birthday dinner and you're dead to us." 3 days later, Reed opened his eyes and whispered something about his mother that made my blood run cold. My name is Dale Harmon. I'm 43 years old, and I work as a construction superintendent in Columbus, Ohio. 20 years of reading blueprints, managing crews, making sure structures don't fail before someone gets hurt. I'm trained to catch problems early. The biggest problem I ever missed was happening right inside my own home, one slow day at a time. I married Renee Stanton 11 years ago. She was 26, I was 32, and I genuinely believed we were building something real together. What I didn't fully account for was her mother, Vera Stanton, 64 years old, sharp-tongued, and absolutely convinced she held a permanent seat at every table in our marriage. Her husband Howard just nodded along to whatever Vera decided. I told myself it was manageable. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, and that was near the top of the list. Our son Reed is 12. Bright kid, obsessed with history, can recite Civil War battle dates like other kids recite sports stats. But starting roughly 2 years ago, Reed kept getting sick in ways that didn't quite make sense. Stomach aches that came and went. Fatigue that lingered for days. Occasional dizziness bad enough to make him grab a wall. Renee took him to doctor after doctor. I noticed, without thinking much about it, that she never stayed with one practice for long. When I finally sat down and counted, it was 7 different pediatricians over 3 years. Every time one of them started digging deeper, she'd quietly move on to someone new. I told myself she was just being a thorough mother. I should have asked harder questions a long time before I did. That October, Reed and I headed down to Hocking Hill State Park for our fall camping weekend, a tradition we kept since he was 7 years old. Those trips were ours. No phones, no schedules, just the two of us on a trail somewhere. Renee had never shown much interest in packing for those trips before, but that year she insisted on doing Reed's bag herself. She also sent along a thermos of hot cocoa, said it was Reed's idea. Reed gave me a puzzled look when she said that, but didn't argue. It was cold out and the cocoa was there, so he drank it. We were about 2 hours into a ridge trail when Reed stopped walking and told me the trees were spinning. I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. His legs gave out, and he went down a rocky embankment off the side of the path, maybe 12 feet. Not a catastrophic drop. Enough. I was down there before I finished thinking about it. He was breathing, eyes open, but couldn't tell me what day it was or where we were. I called 911, kept my hand on his chest, and talked to him about nothing in particular. The trail, the weather, a football game I barely remembered, for 31 minutes until the helicopter broke through the cloud cover above the tree line and found us. Grant Medical Center, Columbus. I drove 90 the whole way. By the time I parked and got through the doors, Reed was already past the ER, and I was just a man in a waiting room who couldn't do a single useful thing except sit in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and try to remember how to breathe. Then my phone buzzed. Text from Vera Stanton. Renee's birthday dinner is tomorrow. Don't you dare miss it. I stared at the screen long enough to read it 3 times. Then I typed, Reed might not make it through the night. Her reply came back fast. Be there, or you're dead to us. I blocked her number without responding, set the phone face down on the chair beside me, and sat there in that quiet, humming waiting room understanding, maybe for the first time with real clarity, exactly what kind of family I had married into, and what it had cost me not to see it sooner. Reed made it through surgery. The doctor, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Paulson, came out around 2 in the morning and told me he had a mild concussion, 2 bruised ribs, and some soft tissue damage to his left shoulder. Nothing broken. No internal bleeding. She said he was stable, sedated, and that I could see him in the morning. I thanked her and went back to my chair. Didn't sleep. Watched the waiting room empty out and fill back up as the hours moved. At 7:30 the next morning, Dr. Paulson found me again, this time with a different expression. She pulled a second chair close and sat down, which told me before she said anything that this wasn't a routine check-in. Mr. Harmon, she said, I've been looking over Reed's medical history. The records your wife authorized us to go back about 2 years. 14 separate visits across 7 different practices. Gastrointestinal complaints, recurring fatigue, 2 episodes of acute dizziness. She paused. The pattern is unusual, especially given that his blood work and imaging from yesterday Both came back essentially normal. I kept my voice level. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that I'm a mandatory reporter, she said, and that I've already filed a report with Franklin County Child Protective Services. That's not an accusation, Mr. Harmon. It's a procedure. But I need to ask, do you have any explanation for why a healthy 12-year-old has been in and out of medical offices for 2 years without a single confirmed diagnosis? I didn't answer right away. I sat with that question and let it settle into everything I already knew but hadn't said out loud yet. 7 pediatricians. Renee always handling the appointments alone. Reed sick at home and perfectly fine on our camping trips until this one. No, I said finally. But I'm starting to. Dr. Paulson nodded slowly. CPS will be in contact with both parents. In the meantime, Reed stays here until we're satisfied he's medically stable and until we understand what we're actually dealing with. I called Hank Lester from the hospital cafeteria while Reed was still sleeping. Hank was my oldest friend. We'd worked construction crews together in our 20s before he went back to school and became an attorney. Criminal defense, mostly, with a background in family law that I'd never imagined needing. He picked up on the second ring. I laid out everything. The camping trip, the thermos, the fall, what Dr. Paulson had just told me. Hank listened without interrupting, which meant he was taking it seriously. Stay at the hospital, he said when I finished. Don't talk to CPS without me present. Don't talk to Renee about any of this yet. She's been calling since last night. I know. Let her call. His voice was steady and deliberate. Dale, if what you're describing is what it looks like, you're going to need to be very careful about every move you make from this point forward. Do you understand me? Yeah, I said. I understand. Good. I'll be there in 2 hours. I hung up and sat at that cafeteria table for a long time, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Somewhere above me, my son was waking up in a hospital bed, and somewhere across town, my wife was calling a number I wasn't picking up. For the first time in 11 years of marriage, that felt like exactly the right call. Reed was awake when I walked in on the third day. Pale, a little swollen around the left eye from the fall, oxygen monitor clipped to his finger, but awake and watching the door like he'd been waiting. That alone told me something. Reed was the kind of kid who filled silences. The fact that he was just lying there, quiet, meant whatever was sitting inside him was heavier than his usual self could carry. I pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down, put my hand over his and didn't say anything. Sometimes you have to give a person room before they can speak. Dad. His voice was rough, still abraded from the breathing tube they'd had an overnight. I need to tell you something. About 2 nights before we left for the trip. Take your time. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, organizing his thoughts the way he always did before saying something important. Then he came back to me. I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs to get some water. The light over the stove was on in the kitchen. Mom and Grandma Vera were sitting at the table talking. They didn't hear me on the stairs. I kept my face neutral and my hands still. Grandma was talking about you, about how you were always at job sites, how you control the finances, how Mom deserved better. Reed paused, and then she said that if something happened to me on the camping trip, if it looked like an accident, that the family would finally have some breathing room. She talked about insurance policies. She said boys fall all the time on hiking trails, and no one asks too many questions. The room felt like the air had been drained out of it. Mom didn't agree, Reed added, his voice careful. But she didn't tell Grandma to stop, either. She just kept crying, and Grandma kept talking like she was planning a grocery run. He looked at me with eyes that were too old for his face. I went back to my room and lay in the dark for hours. And then the next day, Mom packed my bag herself, made the cocoa, stood right there in the kitchen, and watched me drink the whole thermos before we left. Did it taste normal? No. Bitter. Like medicine. I almost said something, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings. He let out a short, humorless breath. Dumb, right? Not dumb, I said firmly. None of this is on you. You understand me? Not a single part of it. He nodded, but I could tell he was still carrying something. 12-year-olds don't shed weight that fast. I squeezed his hand once, stood up, and walked into the corridor. Called Hank Lester. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him everything Reed had just said, word for word, keeping my voice low and steady against the hallway noise. Hank was quiet for a few seconds after I finished. Dale, the thermos, where is it right now? In the bed of my truck. I threw everything in the back when I followed the helicopter and haven't touched it since. Do not touch it. I'm calling a private lab contact in the next 10 minutes. We're not waiting on county processing. His voice was clipped and precise. I'm also going to request the hospital's child advocacy team conduct a formal recorded interview with Reed today, before Renee or Vera gets anywhere near that room. That statement needs to be documented by a professional, on video, before anyone has a chance to influence it. Renee's been texting since last night asking when she can come in. She waits, Hank said flatly. Get back in that room and stay with your son. I'll be there in 90 minutes. I went back in and sat beside Reed for the rest of that morning. Ms. Ellison from the child advocacy team arrived just after noon, composed, experienced, the kind of person who put kids at ease without making it obvious she was trying to. She conducted Reed's interview in a separate room while Hank observed. I stood in the hallway outside and listened to the silence and understood that the life I'd been living for the past 11 years was over. What came next depended entirely on what I did in the hours and days ahead. I intended to get every single one of them right. Hank came out of the observation room with the look of a man who'd just heard something he couldn't unhear. He found me in the corridor, hands in my jacket pockets, and said 4 words before anything else. It's clean and solid. We drove to his office that evening. His conference table was covered in legal pads and printed case precedents before we even sat down, which told me he'd been working since our phone call. He poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward me, and didn't waste any time. I'm going to tell you something you need to hear before we talk strategy, Hank said. Family court in this state statistically favors mothers in initial custody and medical authority determinations. Not because every judge is biased, because the system was built on a framework that's 30 years past its expiration date, and default assumptions run deep. You're going to walk into that courtroom as the father, and you'll have to prove things that Renee will never once be asked to prove, simply because of who you are in relation to that child. I looked at him across the table. So we overprepare. We overprepare, he agreed. Reed's recorded statement is the foundation. The thermos goes to the lab tonight. I already made the call. I want those results in our hands within 48 hours. He made a note. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing an emergency motion for temporary sole medical authority. Renee is not to schedule, authorize, or attend any medical appointment for Reed until the court rules otherwise. She'll fight that. Let her fight it. Fighting in an open court is actually useful to us. Hank leaned forward. Here's what I need from you, Dale. Calm. Deliberate. Every time you walk into a courthouse or sit across from a caseworker, you're being evaluated, whether they say so or not. The second you show anger, Renee's attorney puts that in front of the judge, and suddenly the story isn't about what happened to Reed. It's about your temperament. Do you follow me? I've managed job sites through cave-ins, budget collapses, and crew walkouts, I said. I know how to hold it together when everything's going sideways. Use that, Hank said simply. We were in front of Judge Aldrich by 9 the next morning. She was in her late 60s, silver-haired, and ran her courtroom like she ran it, briskly, without patience for theater. Renee had retained an attorney named Fowler, polished and practiced, who argued that Reed's statement was the account of a concussed minor on pain medication, and that removing maternal medical authority was a drastic overreach based on nothing more than a frightened child's recollection during a traumatic hospitalization. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my hands flat on the surface and let Hank work. He walked Judge Aldrich through the documented record. 7 pediatric practices over 3 years, 14 appointments with 0 confirmed diagnoses, a pattern of symptom onset consistently correlating with time spent at home, the child advocacy interview conducted under proper protocol, and the preliminary lab findings on the thermos, sedative compounds detected, full analysis pending. That last item hit the room like a 2x4. Fowler objected on procedural grounds. Judge Aldrich overruled him without looking up from the page. She read in silence for 3 minutes. Then she set the documents down and looked at both tables. Temporary sole medical authority is granted to Mr. Harmon, effective immediately. I'm appointing a guardian ad litem for the minor child by end of week, someone whose only client is that boy. She looked at Fowler. Your client retains standard visitation rights pending the full hearing. Supervised. Location to be approved by the GAL. She picked up her gavel. We're adjourned. I walked out of that courthouse into the cold October morning and stood on the sidewalk. Hank fell in beside me. 1 round down, he said. How many left? He thought about it honestly. Enough. But today you took the one that sets the table for everything else. I nodded, looked down the street at nothing in particular, thought about Reed in that hospital bed, waiting for me to come back. I went back. Reed had been in the hospital for 5 days when the nurses finally let him sit up properly and eat something that wasn't broth. I brought him a cheeseburger from the place 2 blocks down, his request, very specific, and sat across from him while he ate and tried to look like a normal father having a normal lunch with his kid. It was the best acting job I'd ever done. That evening, while Reed slept, I went down to my truck in the hospital parking garage. I needed his school backpack. He'd asked for his history book and a notebook, and I hadn't touched anything in the truck bed since the night of the accident. I pulled the backpack out from behind the passenger seat and set it on the hood. That's when I saw the iPad. Reed's school iPad had slid halfway under the seat, still in its case. I almost left it. Then I remembered something Reed had mentioned once, offhand, about using the voice memo app to record himself studying. Said hearing the material out loud helped it stick. I picked up the iPad and woke the screen. There was an active recording in the voice memo app. Date stamped the night before we left for Hocking Hills. Runtime, 41 minutes. I sat in that parking garage for a long time before I pressed play. The first few minutes were ambient, house sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, distant television. Then voices. Renee and Vera, clear enough to follow once you adjusted to the recording quality. Reed must have set the iPad on his desk near the floor vent without realizing the app was running. I listened to the whole thing. It was worse than what Reed had described. Not because Vera said anything Reed hadn't told me, but because of how she said it. Methodical, logical, running through contingencies like a project manager reviewing a timeline. She talked about the insurance policies by their payout amounts. She talked about how a father taking a boy hiking in October was statistically unremarkable. She talked about grief as a variable, how a grieving husband was unlikely to think clearly about finances for months afterward. Renee cried through most of it, but she didn't leave the table. I called Hank from the garage. He answered in 2 rings. I've got a recording, I said. 41 minutes. Both of them. On Reed's school iPad. Hank was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Don't touch anything else on that device. Bring it to my office tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. I was there by 8. Hank had his paralegal present and a digital forensics contact on the phone before I'd even set the iPad on the table. Within an hour, the recording had been forensically extracted, time-stamped, and duplicated across 3 secure locations. Hank's paralegal, a young woman named Deb, had gone pale by the midpoint of playback. Hank himself sat very still with his hands folded and listened to the entire thing without moving. When it finished, he looked at me. This changes the shape of everything. I know, it doesn't replace the court process, he said carefully. But as leverage, as a tool to ensure Renee's attorney understands exactly what their client is facing, this is significant. He leaned forward. I'm also reaching out to Ruth Tanner tomorrow morning. Who's Ruth Tanner? Private investigator. Former county sheriff's detective. She's handled 3 FDA cases that I know of. Children being kept medically dependent by a parent for attention and financial benefit. She knows how these cases work from the inside. If there are financial irregularities we haven't found yet, Ruth will find them. I drove back to the hospital that night and sat in Reed's room in the dark, watching him sleep. The recording was secured. The thermos results were due back in 24 hours. The wheels were moving. For the first time since that hillside, I felt like I was ahead of something instead of behind it. The lab results came back on a Thursday. Sedative compound confirmed. A prescription-strength sleep aid, concentrated well above therapeutic dosage, dissolved in the cocoa mixture. The kind of dose that would hit a 12-year-old on a hiking trail at elevation like a hammer. Hank filed the results with the court the same afternoon. Judge Aldrich's clerk called within 2 hours to schedule an emergency status hearing for the following Monday. Fowler, Renee's attorney, went quiet for the better part of a day before calling Hank to ask, very carefully, very indirectly, whether a negotiated resolution might be on the table. Hank told him we'd be in touch. Ruth Tanner arrived at Hank's office on Friday morning. She was 44, compact, with the kind of steady attention in her eyes that came from years of watching people closely for a living. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Tell me about the medical history, she said, opening a notepad. All of it, from the beginning. I walked her through everything. The 7 practices, the 14 appointments, the pattern of Reed being sick at home and well everywhere else. She took notes without interrupting, and when I finished, she set her pen down. "This is a textbook FDA pattern," she said. "Factitious disorder imposed on another. A caregiver manufacturing or exaggerating illness in a child to generate attention, sympathy, or in cases like this, financial positioning. The rotation through multiple practices is classic. You move before any one doctor can establish a longitudinal view." "Can you prove the financial angle?" Hank asked. "Give me access to whatever financial records you have in 72 hours, Ruth said. What happened next came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Howard Stanton, Vera's husband, my father-in-law, 67 years old, called my cell phone on Saturday morning. I almost didn't answer. We'd barely spoken in years. Howard existed at the margins of every family event, quiet, present, unremarkable. I'd always figured he was simply a man who'd chosen peace over engagement. I was wrong about that too. "Dale." His voice was steady but careful. "I need to meet with you. Not at the house. Not anywhere Vera might be." We met at a diner 20 minutes from his neighborhood. Howard arrived first, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a manila envelope on the table in front of him. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. Not just tired, hollowed out, like a man who'd been holding something heavy for a very long time and had finally decided to set it down. He slid the envelope across the table. "I've been keeping this for 4 years, he said. "Every time I told myself it wasn't my place. That was family business. That things would work themselves out." He looked at his coffee cup. "Reed almost died on that hillside. That ended my ability to stay quiet." Inside the envelope, bank statements going back 3 years. Credit card records. Correspondence between Vera and an insurance broker that Howard had printed from her laptop without her knowing. And a handwritten log. Howard's own handwriting, dated entries, documenting conversations he'd overheard between Vera and Renee going back nearly 2 years. Discussions about Reed's medical visits, about the policies, about timelines. I looked up at him across the table. "Howard, why didn't you?" "Because she's my wife," he said simply, "and I kept believing she wouldn't actually go through with it." He met my eyes. "I was wrong. I won't be wrong again." I called Ruth Tanner from the diner parking lot before I'd even started the engine. Told her I had 4 years of documented financial records and a first-hand witness. She was quiet for a beat. Then, "Give me that envelope today." Howard Stanton went home to a woman who didn't know he'd just dismantled everything she'd built. And I drove back toward the hospital understanding that the ground had shifted completely, and that this time, it had shifted in our direction. Ruth Tanner worked fast. She showed up at Hank's office Monday morning with a laptop, Howard's folder, and a legal pad already half filled with notes. And by Wednesday afternoon, she had built a financial picture that made Hank's paralegal leave the room for 5 minutes just to collect herself. Ruth spread the documents across the conference table and walked me through it the same way I imagined she'd once briefed sheriff's detectives. Methodically, without editorial, just fact after fact laid down like bricks. "Your wife has been maintaining a secondary checking account in her name only for approximately 3 years, Ruth began. "Deposits come from 3 sources. First, small transfers from your joint account, always under $800, always categorized as household expenses. Second, reimbursements from Reed's medical insurance claims, routed directly to her account rather than back to the joint account where the original payments came from. Third," she paused and slid a printed statement toward me, "a recurring transfer from a business account registered to Vera Stanton." I stared at the page. Vera has been paying Renee directly, monthly, for 26 months. The amounts vary, anywhere from $400 to $1,200, but the pattern is consistent. Ruth tapped the page. "When you add the total across all 3 sources over 3 years, you're looking at somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 that moved outside your awareness." I sat back in my chair and let that number land. "There's more," Ruth said. She pulled out the insurance correspondence Howard had photographed from Vera's desk. "These emails go back 18 months. Vera was in contact with an insurance broker, not your carrier, a separate broker, exploring the terms of Reed's policy. Specifically, the accidental death clause. Specifically, what documentation would be required for a claim filed by a surviving parent. Hank, who had been quiet through most of this, leaned forward. That's premeditation evidence. That's not a divorce case anymore. That's what I call it, Ruth said evenly. I thought about Reed in his hospital room, eating a cheeseburger, asking me to bring his history textbook. 12 years old and completely unaware that his grandmother had been researching the paperwork requirements for his death. I kept my voice flat. What do we do with this? Ruth looked at me. I've already been in contact with a detective at the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Former colleague of mine. I walked him through the framework, the lab results, the recording, the financial pattern, Howard's documented timeline. He's taking it to his supervisor today. She folded her hands on the table. This is no longer just a custody case, Dale. This is a criminal matter, and the prosecutor's office is going to want to move on it. Hank stood and walked to the window, which changes our divorce strategy significantly. When criminal charges are filed against Renee, and I believe they will be, her attorney's leverage evaporates. The negotiation dynamic shifts completely. When does that happen? I asked. Could be days, Ruth said. The recording and the lab results together are enough for an arrest warrant application. The financial records and Howard's testimony make it airtight. I drove back to the hospital that evening and sat with Reed through dinner. He'd started physical therapy that afternoon for his shoulder and was complaining about it with the particular enthusiasm of a kid who was feeling well enough to complain. I let him talk and ate bad cafeteria food and watched him and thought about how close I had come to sitting in this same hospital in entirely different circumstances. That night, alone in the parking garage, I called Howard Stanton. He answered on the first ring. The prosecutor's office is going to want your testimony, I told him. Formally. On record. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've been ready for that since Saturday. I believed him. The criminal investigation moved faster than I expected. By Thursday of that week, Hank informed me that the Franklin County prosecutor had formally opened a case. Renee had been notified through her attorney. The arrest warrant for Vera was in process. Fowler, Renee's attorney, called Hank that same afternoon, and this time the tone was different. No more procedural maneuvering. No more confused child arguments. Just a man trying to figure out how much damage his client could still limit. But before that conversation could go anywhere useful, something else landed on my desk that I hadn't anticipated. Reed School, Westfield Middle, had a student support counselor named Mr. Briggs. He'd been Reed's counselor for 2 years. Quiet man, mid-40s, the kind of person who blended into the background of parent-teacher nights and never said much. I'd met him twice. Hadn't thought much about him either time. He called my cell phone on a Friday morning while I was driving to Hank's office. Mr. Harmon, he said, I've been following the news about Reed's situation. I want to be upfront with you. I owe you a conversation I should have initiated a long time ago. I pulled into a parking lot and stopped the car. I'm listening. Mr. Briggs explained that over the past 18 months, Reed had come to his office on 4 separate occasions, twice asking general questions about what happened when parents didn't take care of their kids properly, once asking whether a counselor had to tell parents everything a student said, and once about 8 months ago, saying directly that he didn't feel safe at home, but immediately taking it back and asking Briggs to forget he'd said it. I documented the conversations, Briggs said, but I didn't escalate. Mrs. Harmon was a visible presence at the school, fundraisers, the parent advisory committee, volunteers for field trips. I told myself Reed was anxious, that the home environment was stressful but not dangerous. His voice was tight. I was wrong, and I should have acted on what he told me. I sat in that parking lot and kept my breathing steady. Why are you calling me now? Because Reed is in the hospital and I have documentation that belongs in the hands of people who can use it, Briggs said. And because I'd rather face the consequences of what I failed to do than compound it by continuing to stay quiet. I told him to send everything to Hank Lester immediately. He said it was already prepared. When I got to Hank's office and told him about the call, Hank set his pen down and looked at the ceiling briefly. A school counselor with 4 documented sessions in which the child expressed fear and the counselor failed to report. That becomes part of the evidentiary record, and it becomes part of the broader narrative about how long this went unaddressed while Renee maintained a perfect public image. Will it hurt the case? It strengthens it, Hank said. It shows a pattern of behavior sophisticated enough to deceive professionals. Renee wasn't just doing this at home. She was actively building a social presence that made her above suspicion. That's not a woman acting impulsively. That's a woman who planned this carefully over a long period of time. Fowler called again that afternoon. This time he asked outright whether Renee could avoid criminal exposure through full cooperation, full custody transfer to me, complete forfeiture of any claim to marital assets, and testimony against Vera. Hank looked at me across the table. Your call. I thought about $65,000 moved in the dark. About Reed's voice on that hillside when he couldn't tell me what day it was. About Mr. Briggs sitting on 4 documented conversations for 8 months because my wife had volunteered for enough field trips to seem like a good mother. Tell him Renee cooperates fully, I said. Full custody, full forfeiture, full testimony, and she does it in writing before the end of the week. After that, whatever the prosecutor decides, that's between them. Hank picked up his phone. I'll make the call. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for Monday in November, 6 weeks after Reed had been airlifted off that hillside. By then, the criminal case against Vera Stanton had moved through the system with the kind of momentum that only happens when the evidence is so layered and consistent that even the defense has trouble finding a thread to pull. Renee had signed a cooperation agreement the previous Friday. Full custody transferred to me, full forfeiture of any claim to marital assets, and a formal commitment to testify against her mother in the criminal proceedings. Fowler had delivered the signed documents to Hank's office in person, which I took as a small indication of how thoroughly the situation had turned. Attorneys don't make personal deliveries when their side has leverage. The hearing itself was in 2 parts. The first part was the family court custody finalization before Judge Aldrich. The second, later that afternoon, was the preliminary criminal hearing against Vera in a different courtroom across the building. I wore the same suit I'd worn to every courthouse appearance since this began. Reed, who was now home and walking normally and had opinions about what I should wear, told me the tie was too dark. I wore it anyway. Judge Aldrich reviewed the finalized custody agreement, the full evidentiary record, and the guardian ad litem's report, which recommended sole physical and legal custody with me, supervised therapeutic visitation for Renee subject to quarterly review, and a mandatory psychological evaluation for Reed to be conducted by an independent specialist of the gal's choosing. She signed the order in under 10 minutes. Renee sat at her table and didn't look at me once. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a deep and settled quiet. The kind that comes when something that has been structurally wrong for a long time is finally corrected. The criminal preliminary hearing was a different atmosphere entirely. Vera arrived with her defense attorney, a man named Cutler, experienced and deliberate, and she sat at the defendant's table in a gray blazer with the composed expression of a woman who had decided that dignity was still available to her if she held it firmly enough. She was wrong about that, but she hadn't figured it out yet. The prosecutor, a methodical woman named Ms. Vance, walked the court through the case in chronological order. The pattern of medical visits, the thermos results, the financial transfers, the insurance correspondence Howard had photographed, the recording from Reed's iPad. When the recording played in that courtroom, Vera's composure shifted. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for that. But I watched her jaw tighten and her hands move below the table, and I knew she was hearing herself the way the rest of the room was hearing her. Methodical, calculating, running through logistics with the efficiency of a project manager while her daughter cried across the table. Then Reed testified. The court had arranged for a video deposition setup. Reed sat in a separate room with an advocate, visible to the courtroom, on a monitor. Hank had prepared him. The child advocacy team had prepared him, and his therapist had been working with him for 3 weeks. But preparation only goes so far. What came through that monitor was just a 12-year-old boy sitting straight in his chair, speaking clearly, answering every question without embellishment or drama. He described what he'd overheard on the stairs. He described the thermos and the bitter taste, and the way his legs had stopped responding on the trail. He described waking up in the hospital and understanding, in the way that kids sometimes understand things that adults talk around, that what had happened to him wasn't an accident. The courtroom was completely silent while he spoke. Cutler cross-examined carefully, probing for inconsistencies, suggesting that Reed's memory of the overheard conversation might have been shaped by subsequent events and adult conversations. Reed looked at the camera and said, with the particular flatness of someone who has thought carefully about a thing, that he remembered what he remembered because he'd lain awake in his room, replaying it until dawn, and that wasn't the kind of thing a person mixed up. Cutler had no follow-up. Judge Aldrich bound the case over for trial. Vera was remanded, pending a bail hearing the following morning. As the bailiff approached the defendant's table, Vera finally looked across the room. Not at the prosecutor, not at the judge, but at me. I held her gaze and didn't look away. Howard was waiting outside in the corridor. He'd sat in the gallery through the entire hearing. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with relief. The particular exhaustion of a person who has finally put down something very heavy. He extended his hand. I shook it. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once. "Take care of that boy." "That's the plan," I told him. Vera Stanton was denied bail 2 days after the preliminary hearing. Her attorney argued that she was 64 years old, had no prior record, and had deep community ties. The prosecutor pointed to the deliberate, sustained nature of the conduct, the financial documentation, and the fact that the primary witness against her was a 12-year-old child still in her extended family's orbit. The judge agreed that release posed an unacceptable risk. Vera went to the county detention center in a gray blazer and left without looking at anyone in the gallery. The trial itself was 4 months away. In the meantime, I had a life to rebuild, and Reed had a life to get back. We moved into a rental house in Worthington, north of Columbus, close enough to Reed's school that he could stay enrolled without disruption, and far enough from the Stanton family's neighborhood that we didn't have to think about running into anyone. It was a 3-bedroom with a decent yard and a garage I immediately started filling with tools, a habit I'd picked up from my own father and never quite shaken. Reed came home to that house and slept 12 hours the first night. In the morning, he came downstairs and ate breakfast and asked if we could get a dog. I said we'd talk about it. He took that as a yes, which was probably accurate. His therapy continued twice a week with a specialist the GL had selected, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Keene who worked with kids coming out of high-stress family situations. Reed called their sessions the talking appointments and didn't volunteer much about what they discussed, which his therapist said was completely appropriate. What I noticed was that he laughed more easily than he had in years, and that the dark circles under his eyes gradually faded over the first few weeks. Hank wrapped up the divorce settlement in December. Because Renee had forfeited all claims under the cooperation agreement, the division was straightforward. The house was sold, the proceeds split according to the agreement's terms, and my retirement accounts remained fully intact. The $65,000 Renee had moved through hidden channels was treated as an advance against her share, reducing her settlement accordingly. Hank made sure of that. Ruth Tanner's financial work also surfaced something neither of us had expected. A separate life insurance policy on Reed that Renee had taken out 18 months earlier through the broker Vera had been corresponding with, a policy I'd never known existed, naming Renee as sole beneficiary. The existence of that policy became part of the criminal evidentiary record against Vera. Howard Stanton testified at the criminal trial in March. He sat in the witness box in a dark suit and answered every question Ms. Vance put to him with the steady precision of a man who had decided that accuracy mattered more than loyalty to a marriage that had asked too much of him for too long. Renee testified as well, under the terms of her cooperation agreement. Her testimony was damaging. I suspected she knew it and had made her peace with that. Vera was convicted on 2 counts, criminal endangerment of a child and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge sentenced her to 7 years. Cutler announced an appeal. Ms. Vance said she was confident in the record. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd been in that courtroom enough. Instead, I took Reed to see his Saturday afternoon Ohio State football game. His first, something we'd been talking about doing for 2 years and kept postponing. We sat in the upper deck with hot chocolate and watched the Buckeyes win by 3 touchdowns, and Reed explained the defensive scheme to me as if I hadn't been watching football since before he was born. Driving home, Reed was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Dad, are we okay now?" I thought about what okay really meant for the two of us. Not the absence of difficulty, not a guarantee against hard things, but a foundation that was actually solid, built on what was real instead of what we'd been told to accept. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "We're okay." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking out the window at the highway lights. I kept both hands on the wheel and drove us home. That house in Worthington with a decent yard and the garage full of tools was waiting. Reed's history books were on the kitchen table. There was a dog adoption pamphlet on the counter that I pretended not to notice him leave there. We had work to do, the ordinary, unglamorous, day-by-day work of building a life that was actually ours. I had never looked forward to anything more in my entire adult life.
That was one story, but this next one is a little different. Now, let's get into another story.
Hello, welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. I invite you to stroll around the city with me and listen to a new story. Let's go.
Today's story is about a man who let his wife walk away with dignity, only to discover that everything he thought he knew about his marriage was built on a lie. Stay with us.
She told me I didn't deserve her and walked out without looking back. I let her go, but when she showed up at our reunion, someone was standing right behind me. And what drained from her face in that moment changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my business partner, and a child I never knew existed. My name is Otis Hargrove. I'm 43 years old, and for the last 11 years I've co-owned a physical therapy clinic in Asheville, North Carolina. We built it from nothing, me and my business partner Russell Tate, starting with one rented treatment room and a used ultrasound machine that made us sound like a dying engine. Now we have 3 locations, 12 therapists on staff, and a reputation in this town that took 15 years of early mornings to earn. I was proud of what we built, proud the way a man gets when something he made with his own hands actually stands. I was married to Bridget Dalton for 9 years. She kept her maiden name, which I respected. She was smart, sharp, and had this way of walking into a room that made people pay attention. I used to love that about her. Somewhere along the line, I think I confused her confidence for loyalty. Looking back now, there were signs. There are always signs. The late evenings she spent on her laptop with the screen tilted just enough so I couldn't see it without obviously trying. The way she'd come home from her monthly weekend trips with her college friends. Trips I never questioned. A little quieter, a little more guarded. I told myself it was stress. She had her own career in health administration, her own pressures. I thought I was giving her space. What I was actually giving her was cover. The night she left, it wasn't dramatic. That's what I keep telling people when they ask, and the honesty of it still stings. No screaming, no dishes thrown, just Bridget standing in the kitchen doorway, her overnight bag already on her shoulder, telling me in a tone so calm it almost sounded rehearsed that she needed to go. "Otis," she said, her voice flat and measured. "I've been thinking about this for a long time." I was standing at the counter, sorting through the mail. I set down the electric bill and looked at her. "What exactly have you been thinking?" She exhaled slowly, like she was releasing something she'd been holding for a while. "That you don't deserve me. That I've been waiting for you to become something you're never going to be, and I'm done waiting." I remember the exact angle of the evening light through the kitchen window, the smell of the pot roast I'd started an hour earlier. The way her hand gripped the strap of that bag. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask her what she meant, what version of me she decided didn't measure up. But something in her posture told me she hadn't come to negotiate. She'd come to announce. "Okay," I said. That was it. One word. She nodded like I confirmed something, turned around, and walked out the front door. Didn't look back. Didn't slam it. Just closed it behind her with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. I stood in that kitchen for 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing. Then I turned off the stove, threw the pot roast in the refrigerator, and sat down at the table with a glass of water. She said I didn't deserve her, so I let her go. The weeks that followed were a slow kind of suffocation. I threw myself into the clinic. Longer hours, staff meetings I didn't need to call, spreadsheets I'd already reviewed twice. Russell was around constantly, which at the time felt like support. He checked in every few days, brought coffee to the office, asked how I was holding up. I thought he was being a good partner. What I didn't know yet was that the divorce papers Bridget's attorney filed 3 weeks after she left included a demand for 20% of the clinic's equity, a business she had never invested in, never worked in, and had no legal claim to under any reasonable reading of our situation. When my attorney called me with that detail, I went quiet for a long moment. "She wants part of the clinic," I said slowly. "That's what they're claiming," my attorney confirmed. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of our main location, the one Russell and I had built from the ground up, and stared at the front door with a feeling I couldn't name yet. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even surprise exactly. It was more like the first cold drip of a truth that hadn't fully arrived. I thought about Russell, about the way he'd been checking in so often, about the spreadsheets he'd asked to review last month, about the morning he'd come in early and been standing near my desk when I walked in, papers shifted just slightly out of place. I didn't have a theory yet, just a feeling, the kind that sits in your stomach and waits. And then I got the email about the high school reunion. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning, not delivered by an attorney, not hand-carried with any semblance of courtesy, just sitting in my mailbox between a utility bill and a coupon flyer for a pizza place I'd never been to. Bridget's attorney, some sharp-suited firm out of Charlotte, had filed a formal claim that included personal assets, the joint checking account, and 20% equity in Hargrove Tate Physical Therapy, LLC. I read that last part 3 times standing in the driveway in my work clothes. 20% of a clinic I'd built before Bridget, and I'd even gone on our first date. I called my attorney, Daniel Cook, before I'd even made it inside the house. He picked up on the second ring and listened without interrupting while I walked him through it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They're going to argue she supported the household while you grew the business," he said evenly. "It's a stretch, but it's not unheard of. She has no legal stake in that clinic, Daniel. Her name is nowhere near it. I know, but they're counting on this being expensive enough that you'll settle." I hung up and stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Bridget had told me I didn't deserve her. I looked at the counter where she used to leave her coffee cup, always on the left side, never in the cabinet, and felt something sharpen inside me. Not grief, resolve. I drove to our main clinic location 20 minutes later. Russell's truck was already in the lot, which wasn't unusual. He was always first in. One of the things I'd always respected about him. He was in the back office when I walked in, reviewing patient scheduling reports. He looked up and offered that easy grin he'd been flashing for 15 years. "Morning," Russell said. "You look like you slept on a park bench." Bridget's attorney filed. I set the papers on the desk between us. "They're going after 20% of the clinic." He picked up the document, scanned it, and his expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough. A slight tightening around the eyes. A pause that stretched 1 second past comfortable. "That's aggressive," he said finally, setting it back down. "Russell," I kept my voice level. "Is there something I should know?" He met my eyes steadily. "Like what?" "Like whether you've had any conversations with Bridget recently. About the business. About anything." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Otis, come on. Why would I be talking to your ex-wife?" I watched him for a moment. 15 years of partnership teaches you a man's tells. The way Russell rubbed the side of his jaw when he was deflecting. The way he held eye contact just a fraction too deliberately when he was managing a conversation rather than having one. He was doing both right now. "I'm going to talk to the business attorney today," I said, gathering the papers. "I want to make sure our partnership agreement is airtight." "Of course." He nodded, the picture of reasonableness. Smart move. I left the office and sat in my car for a few minutes before starting it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through my calendar, not looking for anything specific, just looking. A pattern I hadn't paid attention to before started taking shape. For times in the last 3 months, Russell had requested access to our shared financial records, each time with a reasonable explanation. Audit prep, insurance renewal, refinancing projections. 4 times. I thought about Bridget's demand, about who might have given her attorney a precise enough picture of the clinic's valuation to know exactly what to ask for. 20% wasn't a random number. It was a calculated one. Somebody had done the math. I drove to Daniel Cook's office that afternoon and sat across from him with the partnership agreement and 2 years of financial disclosures spread on his desk. We went through it line by line. The clinic was protected, but not perfectly. There was a clause, buried in the original agreement, that gave either partner the right to negotiate on behalf of the entity in certain financial proceedings. That clause, I said slowly, could theoretically be used to cooperate with a valuation process in a divorce proceeding. Daniel looked up from the document. Theoretically, yes. Would a partner have to disclose to me if they cooperated with something like that? He paused. Not necessarily. Not if they framed it as routine business cooperation. I sat back. The weight of it settled over me like something cold and slow. If Russell had been feeding Bridget's attorney's information, voluntarily, carefully, plausibly, I might never be able to prove it. But I didn't need proof yet. I needed clarity. I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with. That evening, I got home to a quiet house and an email notification I almost ignored. The 25-year reunion for Asheville High School, a venue downtown, in 3 weeks. I scrolled the RSVP list without expecting much. Bridget Hargrove, attending. I stared at that name. She'd used my last name in the RSVP, which struck me as either careless or deliberate, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Curiosity. Cold, focused, purposeful curiosity. I clicked attending before I could talk myself out of it. The venue was a restored event hall in downtown Asheville. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs, a bar that charged $12 for a beer I could have bought at the gas station for $2. The kind of place that tries hard to feel effortless. I arrived 20 minutes before the listed start time, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to be positioned before Bridget walked in. I wanted to see her face before she had a chance to compose it for my benefit. I stood near the entrance with a glass of water and watched people filter in. Faces I recognized in layers. First the bone structure, then the memory attached to it. 25 years does a lot to a person. Some of them wore it well. Others looked like they'd been fighting the whole time. I was watching the door when a voice came from my left. Otis Hargrove. I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd show. I turned. Jake Dunmore. He looked exactly like the version of himself I remembered, just with more mileage. Same broad shoulders, same direct handshake. He'd moved to Atlanta after college, something in commercial real estate, if I remembered right. Jake. I shook his hand. Long drive from Atlanta. Worth it. He smiled, but there was something underneath it, a purposefulness that didn't quite match the casual tone. You look like a man with something on his mind. Just taking it all in. He nodded slowly. Bridget here yet? The question landed with more weight than a casual inquiry deserved. I studied him for a half-second before answering. Not yet. Right? He glanced toward the entrance and then back at me. Listen, there's something I've been meaning to say. Maybe tonight's the night. Let me find us a quiet corner later. Before I could respond, the room shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle redistribution of attention, the way a crowd unconsciously orients toward something. I followed the current and saw her. Bridget walked in wearing a dark green dress and the particular kind of confidence that comes from having rehearsed your entrance. She scanned the room the way she always did, efficient, measuring, and for one unguarded moment, her eyes landed on me. Then they moved 2 feet to my left, to Jake. What happened to her face in that instant was not a social reaction. It was a physical one. Her chin lifted slightly, her grip on her clutch tightened, and the smooth, rehearsed expression she'd walked in wearing fractured just enough for me to see what was underneath it. Fear, not surprise. Fear. She recovered in under a second and redirected toward the bar, moving with deliberate casualness that told me she was anything but calm. I turned back to Jake. He was watching her too, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. I see it, I said quietly. He glanced at me. She wasn't expecting me. Clearly, I let a beat pass. Jake, why did you really come tonight? He exhaled through his nose and looked back toward the bar where Bridget was now speaking with a group of women, her back to us, her posture rigid beneath the practiced ease. Because I knew she'd be here, he said flatly, and because I've spent about 2 years deciding whether to say what I'm going to say to you. The night moved around us. Music, laughter, the clinking of glasses, and I stood very still at the center of it. Then say it. We found a corner near the back of the hall, away from the DJ and the noise and the reunited cliques reliving moments that had long since stopped mattering. Jake held his drink without touching it. I kept my hands in my pockets. When Bridget and I were together, he began, it wasn't clean. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this to make myself look good, because I don't come out of this looking good either. I nodded once. Go ahead. He turned the glass slowly in his hand. We dated for about 14 months. Senior year into the first year of college. She ended it when she met you, which I accepted. What I didn't know, not until about 2 years ago, was that it didn't actually end when she said it did. I felt something tighten in my chest, but kept my face neutral. Meaning she came back, after you two had already been together for a few months. Twice, maybe 3 times. Said she wasn't sure what she wanted. Said you were serious and stable, but that she missed what we had. He finally took a drink, then set the glass on the windowsill beside him. I'm not proud of it. I was young, and I let it happen. And then she stopped coming back, and I figured she'd made her choice, and I moved on. The noise of the reunion felt very far away. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Jake met my eyes directly, because 6 months ago, I got a call from someone asking questions about Bridget. A financial inquiry, somebody doing background research. I didn't know who it was at the time, but I started asking around. Turns out it was connected to your divorce proceedings. I went very still. What kind of questions? About her character, her history, whether she had a pattern of, he paused, choosing the word carefully, selective honesty. I let that settle. Selective honesty. That was one way to put it. Jake, I kept my voice low and even. Is that all of it? He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him calculating, not deceptively, but carefully, the way a man does when he's deciding how much truth the other person is actually ready for. She talked about Stuart Cromwell, he said finally, when she came back those times. Not by name, just someone she'd met through work, someone she described as important. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Stuart Cromwell. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. City council member, pillar of the Asheville business community, regular attendee at every Chamber of Commerce event I'd been to in the last decade. Married, father of 3. How certain are you? I asked. Not certain at all, Jake admitted. It was a long time ago, and she never said anything direct. But the way she talked about him, he shook his head. It wasn't professional admiration. I stared past him at the room, full of people laughing and reminiscing and carrying on like the world was a simple, orderly place. Thank you, I said, and I meant it without warmth, without gratitude, without anything except precision. Thank you for telling me. I walked back through the crowd, past the bar, past the knots of old classmates who called my name and got a nod in return. I pushed through the side door into the cool mountain air and stood on the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, breathing steadily. Stuart Cromwell, Russell Tate, Bridget's 20% claim. 3 separate facts that had just arranged themselves into a shape I didn't like at all. I pulled out my phone and texted a number I hadn't used in a while. A former patient of mine, a man who'd recovered from a serious knee injury at our clinic and gone on to become a forensic accountant. Someone who owed me nothing but had told me once, plainly and without drama, that he was the kind of man who believed in paying his debts. The text was 4 words, I need your help. His reply came in under 2 minutes. Name the time. 3 days after the reunion, I was at the clinic by 6:30 in the morning. Not because I had early patients, because I hadn't slept past 5 since the conversation with Jake, and lying in a quiet house staring at the ceiling felt like a waste of whatever energy I had left. I made coffee in the break room, spread my files across the conference table, and started working through the partnership agreement clause by clause with a yellow legal pad and a highlighter. That's when my phone buzzed. It was an email from a DNA ancestry service, one of the big consumer platforms. I had an account from 3 years ago when Bridget had convinced me to do the test. She'd framed it as something fun, a way to trace family history. I'd spat in the tube, mailed it off, and forgotten about it almost immediately. The results had come back with nothing surprising. Mostly English and Irish ancestry, a scattering of Northern European. I hadn't logged into the account since. The email said I had a new DNA match. A close one. The platform's algorithm had flagged it as a first-degree or second-degree relative, a match strong enough to indicate a parent, child, or sibling. I didn't have any siblings. My parents were both gone. I set my coffee down very carefully and opened the app. The match was listed under a profile with no photo, no family tree, and a single line of self-description, searching for biological family. Born in Asheville, North Carolina. The match percentage was 47.3. I sat with that number for a long time. 47% was too high for a cousin. Too high for anything except a direct line. Parent to child, or child to parent. Born in Asheville. I thought about what Jake had told me at the reunion. About Stuart Cromwell. About Bridget's behavior during a period of our marriage I'd never fully understood. About a month, early in our second year together, when she'd been sick for weeks, nausea she blamed on a new medication, fatigue she explained as work stress. About the weekend she'd driven to her sister's place in Charlotte and come back hollow-eyed and quiet in a way I hadn't known how to reach. She had told me, with tears that looked completely genuine, that we would never have biological children. She'd seen a specialist, she said. The doctor had been clear. I had held her while she cried. I had grieved alongside her. I had built my understanding of our future around that fact. I opened the match profile again. No name, no photo, just that one line and a location. My hands were steady when I picked up the phone and called Daniel Cook. My attorney. I need to add something to the divorce proceedings, I said when he picked up. I need to know if Bridget ever gave birth to a child during our marriage, and if so, what happened to that child? A pause. Otis, that's a significant. Daniel. I kept my voice level. I have a DNA match on a consumer platform that registers at 47%. A child born in Asheville with no listed family. Either someone set this up deliberately, or there's a child out there connected to me by blood. Either way, I need to know. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. I'll file a motion for medical record disclosure. It'll take a few weeks. File it today. I hung up and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. The morning light was coming in gray and flat off the mountains. A delivery truck was pulling up across the street. Normal world. Normal Tuesday. Everything exactly as it had been an hour ago, except that the ground under my feet had shifted again, and I was starting to understand that it was going to keep shifting until I found what was buried underneath. My forensic accountant contact, a former patient named Douglas Farrell, had already been in touch the day before. He'd found irregularities in the clinic's outgoing financial communications. Specifically, 3 emails sent from Russell's account to an external address, an address that traced back to a legal services firm in Charlotte. Bridget's attorney's firm. Russell hadn't just stayed quiet. He'd actively fed them information. I drove to the clinic's second location that afternoon, where Russell was supervising a staff training session. I waited until it was over, until the room had emptied, and then I closed the door behind me and stood in the center of the room with my arms at my sides. Russell turned from the whiteboard and saw my expression. Whatever he was about to say died on his face. 3 emails, I said. Your account. Charlotte Legal Services. Bridget's attorneys. The color shifted slightly in his face. Not a dramatic change, just a draining, the way a man looks when the play he's been running gets called out loud. Otis, don't. My voice came out quieter than I expected, and somehow that made it worse. Don't explain it. Don't soften it. Just stand there and understand what you did. He set down the marker he was holding, slowly, like he was trying to appear calm and not quite managing it. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he said finally. How far was it supposed to go? He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I walked back to the door, opened it, and spoke without turning around. My attorney will be in touch with yours. Don't touch any financial records. Don't contact any of our clients. And don't come into either clinic location until this is resolved. I paused. 15 years, Russell. 15 years, and you handed her a weapon. I walked out into the hallway and kept walking. I didn't slam the door. Didn't need to. The truth has a way of making enough noise on its own. I found on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the reunion. I'd been working through the house systematically, not out of sentimentality, but out of necessity. My attorney had advised me to inventory joint property before the divorce proceedings advanced, and I'd been moving through each room with a clipboard and a camera on my phone, documenting everything that mattered and some things that didn't. The bedroom was last. Bridget had taken most of what she wanted in the initial move. The closet was half empty. The nightstand on her side had been cleared, but on the wall above the dresser, she'd left the framed photo we'd taken on our 3rd anniversary. A mountain overlook outside Asheville, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember now. She'd left it the way you leave something you want the other person to have to deal with. I lifted it off the wall to photograph it. Standard black frame, glass front, the kind sold in every home goods store in America. I turned it over to note the dimensions on my clipboard. That's when I felt it, a slight unevenness in the backing board. I pressed it and heard something shift inside. The backing panel on this particular frame had a shallow, recessed lip, a design feature I'd never noticed in 3 years of looking at the thing. I pressed the corner and it popped loose. Behind the cardboard backing was a folded envelope. No stamp, no address, just a piece of correspondence that had been hidden in a frame hanging on our bedroom wall since God knows when. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I set the frame on the dresser and opened the envelope. The letter inside was handwritten. Bridget's handwriting. I knew every curve of it. 2 pages front and back, written in the kind of compressed, urgent script that comes from needing to get something out fast before you change your mind. It was addressed to C, not a full name, just an initial, and not the kind of letter you write to a colleague. The first lines were enough to make my jaw tighten. I keep telling myself it was one night and that it doesn't define anything. But I've been lying to myself so long, I'm not sure I know the difference anymore. Otis doesn't know. He won't know. He's the kind of man who trusts what he's told. And right now, that's the only thing keeping this from falling apart. I put the letter down on the dresser, picked it up again, read it through twice more, slowly, not missing a word. She wrote about a conference, a 2-day healthcare administration summit in Charlotte, about 18 months into our marriage. She wrote about Stuart Cromwell speaking at a panel session, about a dinner afterward, about a sequence of decisions she dressed up as accidents and then admitted weren't. She wrote about the weeks after, the nausea, the fear, the appointment she made alone and kept alone. She wrote about not knowing, and then knowing, and then making a choice she called the only one I could live with. And at the bottom of the second page, in that compressed, urgent handwriting, she had written, if I kept it, everything would have come out. So I told him we couldn't have children. He believed me. He held me while I cried about it. That's the part one can't get past. Not what I did, but the fact that he held me. I folded the letter very carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 9 years, and stayed there for a while without moving. She hadn't miscarried. She'd made a choice and buried it inside a marriage and a picture frame and 11 years of curated normalcy. I thought about the DNA match on my phone. The profile with no name, no photo, just born in Asheville and 47.3%. If the child existed, and every instinct in my body said the child existed, then Bridget hadn't been entirely in control of the burial. Because DNA doesn't stay buried. It finds its way to the surface the same way water finds the lowest point. Patient, inevitable, indifferent to whatever walls you build against it. I photographed every page of the letter with my phone. Then I called Daniel Cook. The medical record motion, I said when he answered. Expedite it however you can. And add a secondary inquiry. I need to find out if a child was placed for adoption in Asheville, North Carolina, approximately 8 to 9 years ago. Connected to Bridget Dalton. Otis. His voice was careful. Are you certain you want to open this door? I looked at the frame still sitting on the dresser. At the photograph of 2 people laughing on a mountain overlook, not knowing yet all the things they didn't know. The door's already open, I said. I just finally walked through it. I didn't go looking for Stuart Cromwell. He came to me. It was a Tuesday evening, 11 days after I'd found the letter in the frame. I was in the clinic after hours, working through patient files that didn't need working through, but gave my hand something to do while my head processed everything that was still settling. The front door was locked. The parking lot was empty. So when I heard a knock at the glass, I almost didn't answer it. He was standing outside in a charcoal overcoat. No aide, no driver visible anywhere. Just a city council member standing alone under the fluorescent wash of the clinic entrance, looking like a man who had rehearsed something and was no longer sure he had the words right. I unlocked the door and held it open without stepping aside immediately. Otis Hargrove, he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. I know this is unexpected. That's one word for it. I stepped back and let him in. He didn't sit when I gestured toward the waiting area chairs. He stood in the center of the room with his hands clasped in front of him, which was either a posture of sincerity or one he'd practiced for public appearances. I couldn't tell yet which. I heard through channels that your attorney has been making inquiries, he began. About me. About Bridget. About certain events from several years ago. Your channels are reliable, I said flatly. He nodded. I want to be direct with you. Then be direct. He exhaled slowly. Bridget and I had a brief involvement approximately 8 years ago. It was during a healthcare leadership summit in Charlotte. It was wrong. It was short, and I ended it. He paused. I want you to know that I didn't know she was going to. That there were consequences I wasn't informed of until much later. She told you eventually. His jaw tightened. Yes, after the fact. After all of it. She contacted me about 2 years ago. Said there had been a child. Said the child had been placed for adoption. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at me. She wanted money. Not a large amount. Just enough to make her feel like the burden was shared. Something cold moved through me. Not surprise anymore. Just the steady accumulation of facts arranging themselves into a portrait of a woman I had never actually known. Did you pay her? I asked. Once, he admitted. I shouldn't have. It wasn't an acknowledgement of paternity. I made that clear through my own attorney. But I was afraid of what the exposure would do to my family. He stopped, and for the first time he looked genuinely ashamed rather than just managed. I'm telling you this because I understand you have a DNA match that may connect you to this child. And if that child is yours biologically, or mine, that matters more than my political career. I studied him for a long moment. He was 50 years old, well-fed on public confidence, and right now, he looked about as substantial as paper. I'm going to need that in writing, I said. Everything you just told me. Dates, amounts, communications. My attorney will draft an affidavit, and you're going to sign it. He stiffened slightly. Otis, if this becomes public, then it becomes public. I kept my voice even. You came here tonight because you wanted to manage this quietly. I understand that impulse. But a child exists somewhere in this world who deserves to know the truth about where they came from. That matters a lot more to me than your comfort. I moved toward the door and opened it. You'll hear from Daniel Cook's office by end of week. I'd recommend cooperating fully. He left without another word. I locked the door behind him and stood alone in the empty clinic, the clinic I had built that someone had tried to use as a weapon against me, and I felt something clarify inside my chest. Not peace exactly, but direction. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop waiting for the truth and start pulling it toward you. Gloria Dalton called me on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Stuart Cromwell's visit. I almost let it go to voicemail. She was Bridget's mother, and my instinct said that any contact from that direction was either a manipulation or the prelude to one. But Gloria had always been different from her daughter in the ways that mattered. She was a straight-talking woman from Western North Carolina who had worked 30 years as a school administrator and had no patience for anything she called performance. I picked up. Otis. Her voice was tired in a way I hadn't heard before. I'm not calling for Bridget. I need you to know that up front. Okay, Gloria. I'm listening. She called me last week, Gloria said, crying, asking me to talk to you. To put in a good word, she said, about the divorce settlement. A pause. I told her I wouldn't do that. And then I told her something she didn't want to hear, which was that she made her bed and she needs to lie in it. Her voice was hard and sad at the same time. The particular combination that belongs to parents who love their children and are ashamed of them simultaneously. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I have something that belongs to you, or that you should have seen a long time ago. She arrived at my house that Saturday morning with a cardboard box and a casserole dish she set on my counter without asking. I didn't argue. Gloria Dalton bringing food was Gloria Dalton's way of saying she was sorry for something she hadn't done, but felt responsible for anyway. We sat at the kitchen table, and she opened the box. Inside were a handful of items, an old birthday card, some photographs, and, at the bottom, a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in Bridget's handwriting. I looked at it without touching it. She gave that to me 4 years ago, Gloria said quietly. Asked me to keep it. Told me it was something she'd written that she wasn't ready to send. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to you. She folded her hands on the table. Nothing happened to her. She just walked out of your life. And I decided that was close enough. I picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. Gloria. I met her eyes. Did you know? About any of it. She was quiet for a long moment. I knew she wasn't happy. I knew she had a tendency to run from things instead of face them. That's a pattern she learned young, and I blame myself for some of it. She looked at the table. I didn't know about the child. I want you to believe that. I did believe it. Gloria's shame was the real kind, not the performed kind.
This man held his wife while she cried about not being able to have children, and she was lying to his face the entire time. I don't know how you come back from that kind of betrayal.
I opened the envelope after she left. The letter inside was long, 4 pages, and different in tone from the one I'd found in the frame. That one had been urgent, confessional, written in a rush. This one was slower, more deliberate, written based on the references inside about 4 years ago. She wrote about everything. About Russell, who she admitted had approached her, not the other way around, with the idea of using the partnership agreement's valuation clause. She hadn't sought him out. He had come to her, offered information, and she had taken it. She wrote that she believed it was because Russell had wanted a path to full ownership of the clinic and had seen the divorce as his opportunity. She wrote about Stuart, about the child, about the adoption, a private arrangement through an agency in Asheville, a boy placed with a family in the same city. She wrote the agency's name, and at the very end, in the last paragraph of the last page, she wrote something I hadn't expected. I know you'll find all of this eventually. You're the kind of man who doesn't let things stay buried. I told myself for years that was a flaw. I understand now that it was the one thing about you I should have trusted completely. I'm sorry, Otis. Not for leaving. I think we both know that was the right ending. But for the years before the ending. For the version of you that deserved better and got me instead. I folded the letter, set it on the table, stared at the grain of the wood for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called Daniel Cook. I have the agency name, I said. Let's find the boy. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. That's the thing movies get wrong about divorce proceedings. They make it look like a stage. In reality, it's fluorescent lighting, stiff chairs, and a judge who has seen 1,000 versions of the same human failure and stopped being surprised by any of them. Judge Patricia Odom was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed and unhurried. She moved through the proceedings the way a surgeon moves through a procedure. No wasted motion, no unnecessary commentary. When Daniel Cook laid out our case, she listened without expression. When Bridget's attorney began his counterargument about the clinic's equity, Judge Odom held up one hand. "Counselor," she said, "before we proceed further on the business valuation claim, I'd like to address the affidavit submitted by Stuart Cromwell." Bridget's attorney paused. Across the aisle, I watched Bridget go very still. The affidavit covered everything Cromwell had told me in the clinic that Tuesday evening. The involvement, the payment she'd requested and received, the admission that she had approached him for money in exchange for silence. It didn't establish legal liability on its own, but it did something more useful in the context of a courtroom. It demolished her credibility as a claimant. Judge Odom looked over her reading glasses at Bridget's side of the room. The court takes a dim view of litigants who pursue financial claims against a spouse while simultaneously receiving undisclosed payments from a third party connected to conduct during the marriage. She set the document down. The equity claim against Hargrove Tate Physical Therapy is dismissed. Bridget's attorney started to respond. The judge looked at him once, and he stopped. The financial forensics came next. Douglas Farrell presented the email records showing Russell's communications with Bridget's legal team. 3 separate transmissions of internal clinic financial data over a 4-month period. The judge reviewed the printouts without comment, asked 2 clarifying questions about the timeline, and made a note on her legal pad. By the time we walked out of that courtroom 2 hours later, Bridget had left with nothing she'd come for. No equity, no claim against the clinic. Her attorney's fees were substantial. Her credibility in Asheville's professional community was beginning its quiet collapse, and the payment she'd extracted from Stuart Cromwell, now in the court record, had become a matter of public documentation. Outside on the courthouse steps, Daniel shook my hand. "Clean sweep," he said simply. I nodded, put on my sunglasses, and walked to my car. Clean sweep. 15 years of building something. 11 years of a marriage built on sand. And now, finally, solid ground under my feet. Russell Tate resigned from the partnership 3 days later, citing personal reasons in a letter that was so carefully worded it almost read as professional. His attorney had already been in contact with Daniel about a structured buyout, Russell offering to sell his equity stake at a reduced valuation in exchange for a clean separation and no civil litigation. I agreed to the terms. Not out of generosity, out of efficiency. I didn't need a legal battle. I needed my clinic back, whole and functioning under my name alone. Bridget tried to call me once, the week after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 40 seconds of carefully assembled words that added up to something between an apology and an explanation and landed as neither. I deleted it without saving it and went back to what I was doing. Stuart Cromwell announced 2 months later that he would not seek re-election to the city council. The press release cited family priorities. Nobody in Asheville's professional circles seemed surprised, and nobody said what they actually knew, which is how those things tend to go. The agency in Asheville, the name Bridget had written in her letter, confirmed, through the legal process Daniel had initiated, that a private adoption had been processed approximately 8 years prior. The child was a boy. He was 8 years old now, living with an adoptive family in the same city where he'd been born. His family had registered his DNA with the Ancestry platform 18 months ago at his request, because even at 8, he'd been asking questions that deserved answers. His name was Caleb. I wasn't his biological father. The paternity testing confirmed that Stuart Cromwell was. But I was the man whose DNA was in that platform because Bridget had submitted it without my knowledge, trying to know the answer while controlling who else could find it. The cruelty of that was particular and sharp. But Caleb existed. He was asking questions. And whatever the biology said, I had played an unwitting role in the architecture of his story. I didn't pursue contact. That wasn't my place. But I did write a letter, a short one, addressed to his adoptive parents through the agency, explaining what I knew and offering to answer any questions they might have on behalf of the boy when he was older. I told them his biological father was a man who had chosen to step back from public life and who had, in the end, done the right thing on paper. What they told Caleb was their decision to make. I sealed that letter, handed it to Daniel, and drove back to the clinic. Walking in through the front door of Hardgrove Physical Therapy, my name now, singular, I stood for a moment in the lobby. Clean floors, quiet waiting area, the faint sound of a patient working through a shoulder exercise in room 3. The ordinary, dignified sound of a place that helps people heal. I built this, piece by piece, year by year, with my own hands and my own decisions. Someone had tried to take it from me using my own trust as the lever. They hadn't managed it. I hung up my jacket, picked up the morning schedule, and got to work. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a message through the Ancestry platform. Not from Caleb. He was 8, and 8-year-olds don't navigate these platforms on their own. It was from his adoptive mother, a woman named Patricia, who wrote with the careful warmth of someone who had thought very hard about every word. She wrote that Caleb was doing well, that he was curious and athletic and had recently developed an obsession with building things out of whatever materials he could find in the garage. She wrote that they had told him, in age-appropriate terms, that his biological family was complicated, but that there were people who knew about him and cared that he was okay. She wrote that he had asked her to pass along one thing. She included a photo, a boy with a gap-toothed grin, standing in front of a half-built birdhouse, holding a hammer with both hands and squinting into the sun like he owned the whole afternoon. I looked at that photo for a long time. I couldn't see Bridget in him particularly. I could see someone who was just beginning to figure out who he was, which is all any of us are doing at any given point. I wrote back to Patricia, thanked her, told her Caleb looked like a kid who knew how to handle tools, which in my experience was a good sign in a person. Jake Dunmore called me around that same time to check in. We'd stayed loosely in touch since the reunion. Not close friends, but the kind of men who'd been through something adjacent together and respected each other for it. He'd testified briefly in the civil proceedings related to Russell's liability, straightforward stuff, and had handled it without complaint. "You good?" he asked. Getting there, I told him. "You? Better than I was," he said. And that felt like enough. Leanne Forsyth, quiet Leanne, who had stood near the valet stand at the reunion and heard Bridget say the words that started the unraveling, sent me a card about 3 months after the court proceedings concluded. No return address, just a card with a mountain landscape on the front and 2 lines inside. Glad the truth found its way. Take care of yourself, Otis. I kept it on my desk at the clinic, not out of sentimentality, out of the reminder that decency still existed in people who had no particular reason to offer it. The clinic grew that year. We hired 2 additional therapists, opened a 4th location on the east side of Asheville, and landed a contract with a regional hospital network that kept us fully booked through the following spring. I worked hard, and I slept well, and I stopped looking at the left side of the kitchen counter for a coffee cup that wasn't there. I didn't look for anyone new. That wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was just how things were, and I was at peace with it. A man who has spent 11 years inside someone else's lie needs time to remember what his own truth feels like before he offers it to anybody else. I was 44 years old. I owned a business that was entirely mine. I had my name back, my work back, my footing back. And some mornings, driving in early while Asheville was still quiet and the mountains were just shapes in the gray light, I thought about a boy with a hammer and a gap-toothed grin building something in a garage. I hoped he kept building. I hoped he built things that lasted.
Otis didn't chase revenge. He didn't fall apart. He just kept building his business, his life, himself. And that, I think, is what real strength looks like. Not anger, not bitterness, just a man who refused to let someone else's lies define his story. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourselves. See you in the next one.